You've probably heard this before. Treat others the way you want to be treated. It's simple, it's familiar, and most of us were taught that growing up. And in theory, it makes sense. You give respect, you get respect. You show up for people, they show up for you. But that sounds good until it's not mutual. Until you're showing up well and it's not being returned. Until you're being kind, being patient, being intentional, and the energy is just not the same on the other side. I think that's where it gets real, because now the question is not just how should I treat people, but who am I when it's not reciprocated? What does it actually look like to live out the golden rule in real life when there isn't a healthy give and take? How do we navigate that in a way that still reflects Christ, but also honors ourselves? I don't have all the answers, but I do have some thoughts, so let's talk about it. With that being said, let's get into it. Hey y'all, I'm your host, Sharaya Devon, and this is Kingdom Conversations. I was having a conversation, and in this conversation, I was talking about a myriad of things. And a moment came in the conversation when I was speaking about reciprocity and my personal definition of what I thought it meant and how I expected people to show up in my life based upon how I show up, specifically as a friend. I was sharing that there are ways in which I choose to show up not just as a person, but as a friend. And it's my hope that the people that I am in relationship with will also reciprocate that. Basically, the golden rule, treat people the way you'd like to be treated. And as I was having this conversation, I literally had an epiphany. As I was giving my TED talk, my spiel about how I wanted things to be reciprocated and how I show up as a friend, I had a simultaneous other thought about, the golden rule is a biblical principle. It's become a universal principle. It's become a principle that people follow in the world, whether they believe in God or not. But it absolutely is a biblical principle. That is its origin. And I began to think about, what does God say about reciprocity? What does he say about this mutual exchange? And so it got me thinking. And so I needed to do a deep dive, as I always do. And I needed to do some research on this social psychological term of reciprocity. And I also just needed the literal term because I've heard it be used and I never necessarily applied it to the golden rule, but it got me thinking. So basically, Merriam-Webster describes reciprocity as just like a mutual exchange, a shared action or shared influence or shared response. But when we think about this social psychological structure of reciprocity, it actually goes a little deeper. It reflects a sense of mutual dependence where what is offered is met with something in return. It's a relational perspective. It represents a healthy balance of giving and receiving. And I thought, okay, I really like this term mutual exchange. That's something that really resonated with me. And as you heard in the opener, my wheels began to turn because my gripe in my conversation was not about mutual exchange. There would be no gripe if it was mutual. My gripe is, how do I show up when there is not a mutual exchange? And it pushed me to think about, on an even more spiritual level, how am I going to continue to be a reflection of Christ and engage in this mutual exchange with others when that exchange is not reciprocated? And as I said in the beginning, I don't have all the answers. I'm not sure if by the end of this episode, we will have reached a mutual consensus about it. But it's the tension I'm holding. Because as I continue to think about it, if I'm going to be a reflection of Christ, then I can't stop showing up the way I choose to show up, even if it's not reciprocated. But then I get upset But then I began to be filled with unpleasant emotions. And then I can get into this realm of what I'm doing or how I show up can easily become transactional or conditional. And that is not the way in which I want to show up. So, reciprocity, friends. How do I continuously and consistently show up for myself and for others in the hopes that it will be reciprocated and the risk that it might not? What do I do? How do I balance it? Well, the only infallible, flawless measuring stick we have is Jesus. So let's see what Jesus said. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus is concluding his Sermon on the Mount. And in a previous episode, we briefly talked about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in a different chapter. And so in chapter 7, Jesus is continuing to teach about how we are to show up if we're going to be followers of him, if we're going to be his disciples. And in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, he says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or treat others in the way you would have them to treat you. And I think the golden rule absolutely is given a positive spin because my mind initially thinks of positive things like be kind, be respectful, be patient, be loving, be compassionate. But we don't always show up that way. And I think Jesus teaches about us operating in this principle of reciprocity to not only be an example of how we should show up and treat people, but also as a way of checks and balances to hold us accountable when we aren't treating people positively. And so if we go back to the beginning of chapter 7, before he gets to verse 12, when he is telling his disciples to treat others the way you want to be treated. If we go to the beginning of that chapter, Jesus is giving a list of other ways in which a disciple, a Christ follower should, conduct themselves, kind of like a check your character checklist. And so before we get to verse 12, Jesus talks about, not judging others and not being so hard on people when we may be showing up the same way. He gives an example of having, like a speck in your eye. Like, don't point out to your friend, like, hey, you're doing this thing when you also, in fact, might be struggling or experiencing the same. And as he continues to share like these ways in which you should show up, then we get to verse 12 when he says, hey, treat people the way you want them to treat you. This is what the law and the prophets are all about. Or another version says, like, this is what the law of the prophet says. Because this wasn't a new thought. This wasn't a new life principle. In fact, Jesus is referencing scriptures from the Old Testament that talked about treating people the way you wanted to be treated. So this wasn't a new concept. It was something that he was referencing. And so if we think about this golden rule as a way to hold us accountable to how we show up, a way to hold us accountable to what kind of character we want to have, and even further, to be a reflection of Christ, then we have to look at a few things. One, we need to look at the whole picture. Sometimes I believe that if a person is not reciprocating in the ways in which you need, it's because they don't know what you need. If we're talking about friendships, I think it's unfair to assume that because we're friends or in some relationship, whatever that relationship is, that you should just know what I need and meet that need. So sometimes people might not know. And it's our responsibility to share with people what it is that we need from them in the relationship that we're in. Secondly, I think that if a person is not showing up, if there is no mutual exchange, we have to consider not an excuse, but I do think we have to consider if they actually possess those skills to be in this mutual exchange. Third, it's okay if things aren't being reciprocated, because this is when boundaries come into play. There are going to be people that come into our lives that might not be able to reciprocate the things that we need. And so it's our responsibility as we become older and as we mature and evolve and become emotionally intelligent to set boundaries. Boundaries are put in place not to keep people out, but they're really put in place to keep people in, the people that you hold close. And so when I talked about these negative emotions that were coming up in this conversation that I was having about reciprocity and friendship and how I'm showing up and how I would like other people to show up, I also had to take a step back and think about what boundaries do I need to put in place so that I'm not feeling that way anymore. Not because I don't want them to show up for me, but if they don't possess the skills, or if I have not shared with them what I need, then I have to set boundaries. And that is a way that I show up for myself. And that is a way in which I can choose myself and show up for myself. Now that I think about it, I don't think that it's okay if there's no reciprocity, if there's no mutual exchange. But I do take that information as data, and what I do with that data is my responsibility. So I hear you. I hear you thinking. So what's the point, Sharia? What are you getting at? What am I supposed to do with this information? You told me about reciprocity. I know about the golden rule. You told me about what Jesus said. Okay, now what? I hear you. I got you. The point is this, that if I am going to be a reflection of Christ, there are multiple things I can do as it relates to treating people the way I want to be treated to accomplish that. And I think the main one is that how I show up is not dependent on how someone else shows up. How I show up is dependent on what God has commanded me to. Now, multiple truths can exist. That doesn't mean that I don't set boundaries. That doesn't mean that I don't take information as data and adjust and evolve and decide how I'm going to interact and be in those relationships. And if a mutual exchange is not happening and I am the person that is showing up to be a part of this exchange, that's not on me. And that's hard. But treating people the way I would like to be treated was never contingent on me receiving something in return. Treating people the way Christ would treat people is a command. And I believe that there are different seasons in our lives that really push us to the edge of how far we'll go to honor this command. Because we live in the same world, friends. And being kind and compassionate and loving doesn't seem to be a foundational principle of people. Being kind is something that is so overrated that we're so surprised when people extend kindness to us, or we rightfully so have a raised eyebrow or a squinted eye because we want to know, like, what's the catch? But I do believe that if we continue to love ourselves and love God more, so that when we show up, people aren't just encountering us, but they are encountering the characteristics of Jesus, then in some way there is some resolve. I think the biggest difficulty about the golden rule is because it hinges on reciprocity. Christ said, treat people the way in which you want to be treated. And in that statement, it goes both ways. The accountability are on all parties. The responsibility are on all parties to hold up their end. And when that is not happening, it pushes us to lean into how much more can I be a reflection of Christ in this moment? How do I still show love and care to someone when they aren't showing that love and care to me? Because honestly, it's not about them. It's about you. It's about us and how we choose to show up. Thinking about this episode and sharing my thoughts about reciprocity and the golden rule has caused me to think about my Nana so very much. And my Nana was a very, very pivotal person in my life and my upbringing and my best friend, hands down. And I remember growing up and seeing that my Nana always had cards next to her bed. Always. And I would always say to myself, Nana, why you got all these cards? Like blank cards, sympathy cards, birthday cards, thinking of you cards, like whatever the celebration would cause for. And so she sent cards regularly to people, unprompted. If someone had a death in their family, she was sending a sympathy card. If it was someone's birthday, she was sending a birthday card. If she was just thinking about somebody, she was sending a thinking of you card. And I can't think of many times when I heard people come back and say like, hey, thank you for this card, or I appreciate you sending me this card. And I know people did. There were moments where I heard it, but I mean, as far as the amount of cards that I know that she sent out, I'm pretty sure that she did not get like that many thank yous in return. I mean, in the time that I known her, that she was sending out, she probably sent out thousands of cards, for sure, thousands. But the point I'm making is that she wasn't doing it to get something in return. Now, is it affirming and wonderful to know that someone has gratitude for you and is thankful for, how you show up for them? Absolutely. Absolutely. And she was doing it because that is what Christ commanded us to do. She was doing it because of her relationship with God. She was doing it because she loved God and therefore she loved people. And whether or not that was going to be reciprocated, I would hear her say that like God was going to reward her. And God was going to honor her. While I wish I could have given her some tips on boundaries for all the things she did for people, nevertheless, it was about her character and her value and what she stood for. And when she went to receive her earnest reward, there were so many people sharing how she touched their lives that you never knew because it wasn't transactional. It wasn't conditional. It was because she was being Christ-like and honoring God and honoring others. And so treating others the way we want to be treated is the golden rule because it is a reflection of our character, an even bigger reflection of God's character. And our relationship with God is not transactional. It's not conditional. And so Matthew 7:12 is a command to Christ's followers and disciples as a way to hold yourself accountable to how Christ-like you're being. And it's an example of how to treat other people. It's another extension of God's character of love. As I've been sitting with this, I've started to think about reciprocity a little differently. Maybe it's not just about what's happening between me and other people. Maybe the reciprocity that actually matters most is vertical. When I really think about it, how I show up is not dependent on how someone else shows up for me. It's rooted in my relationship with God and what He's called me to do. Now, that doesn't mean I ignore what's happening in front of me. It also doesn't mean that I don't set boundaries or take information and adjust how I move in relationships. But it does mean that I'm not waiting on people to complete the exchange in order for me to be who I'm called to be. Because treating people the way I want to be treated was never meant to be contingent on what I get back. It's a reflection of my character. And even more than that, it's a reflection of God's character. So maybe the question is not are they giving me what I'm giving them? Maybe the question is, am I aligned with how God is calling me to show up? Am I aligned with how God is calling me to treat others? And if I am, then I can trust that nothing I give in love, nothing that I give in kindness or thoughtfulness, or even integrity is wasted, even if it's not returned by people. The golden rule was never just about reciprocity. It was never meant to be a guarantee that what you give would always come back the same way. It was a standard, a command, a way to hold ourselves accountable to how we show up. Treating people the way we want to be treated is not about controlling how they respond. It's about being clear on who we are. And if I say that I want to be a reflection of Christ, then that has to show up in how I love and how I respond and how I engage, even when it's not being returned. And that's not easy. It's not convenient. It doesn't always feel good, but it's consistent. Because at the end of the day, this is not about them. It's about you. It's about me. It's about us. It's about how we choose to show up. And maybe that's what the golden rule was always pointing us back to: God and his character, and how he wants us to show up in a world that direly needs him. Until next time, this is Kingdom Conversations. Thank you for listening to Kingdom Conversations. Make sure you follow us on Instagram at Kingdom Convo Podcast. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast so that you stay up to date with all new episodes of Kingdom Conversations. Kingdom Conversations are new every Tuesday.